Chapter 19. The Road to Hana. They were all mad at me now. "Why don't you just sit down in the wheelchair? We're in a hurry, goddammit, and we're gonna miss the flight this way," Remco said. I refused. It was one of those wheelchairs you can borrow from the airport. I could somewhat understand their irritation. Martin gently tried to push me down into the wheelchair while Remco held it behind me, but I managed to get my right hand in the perfect position on top of the back of the wheelchair, and that was enough to provide resistance. If anyone else in the airport was watching, it must have been a funny scene, but I just did not care. The Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam is an enormous one-terminal building. That makes the airport a popular hub since you can always arrive in the same terminal that your connecting flight departs from. No bus or train transfers are needed. The downside of the one-terminal concept is that it could easily be a 1-kilometer walk from check-in to the departure gate. At my walking pace, it would take at least 45 minutes to reach gate D28. Murphy's Law also applied, since that was one of the furthest gates distance-wise. At the time, I walked with a brace on my left lower leg up to the knee with a cane in my right hand. Still, I had trouble with my balance, so my pace was slow. But I refused to sit in that wheelchair. It might sound as if I was simply being difficult with my family, but to me, it meant a great deal to stay out of that chair. I had been working my butt off over the past 8 months to get myself out of it, so I was not going back under any circumstance, period. It was the first day after my Klimendal episode, and I was completely done with the rehab clinic now. It was entirely up to me to get better from that point on. Remco had suggested that we, as a family, celebrate this in a way that had motivated me for the past months. We would go on a trip. It would be a graduation present to Martin and a gift to me to help me start living again in my new life. So, we were off to Hawaii. That was so typical of Remco. Some people might have suggested that I allow myself a trip to some place temperate and not too far away, like the south of Spain or Greece. But Remco loves doing the opposite. Instead of going somewhere easier and relatively close, he decided we would go to Hawaii for 3.5 weeks over Christmas. I love the idea of visiting 4 of the main islands. Remco was great at arranging family trips. Since he worked for a tour operator back then, he knew when to book the tickets and hotels and how to figure out where to get a discount for travel professionals. While all this was going on, Elle, street smart as usual, managed to get a handsome guy in one of the airport golf carts to drive the 2 of us to gate D28. Remco, Martin, and Madeline had to run to catch up with us. We were all so excited that by the time we arrived at the gate in time, they had forgiven me for not getting out of that wheelchair. I was still taking blood thinners, clopidogrel, and cholesterol-lowering medication, simvastatin. I also wore compression socks during the flight, because I have factor V Leiden, a mutated form of human factor V, which causes blood clotting. Many people would hear that additional piece of medical history and say, "That factor V Leiden must have been the cause of your stroke." However, in the hospital, doctors deemed that unlikely. Factor V Leiden is a rather weak risk factor for thrombosis, blood clots, especially in its heterozygote form. It's primarily associated with thrombosis in the venous system within your lower body. Examples of that are DVT, deep vein thrombosis, in the legs or a pulmonary embolism. In rare cases, a clot can form in the veins and then migrate to the arterial side, the upper body, and then cause a stroke, which one could interpret as thrombosis in the brain's arteries. To find out if this so-called paradoxical embolization had happened, the doctors needed to determine if I had a hole in my heart, usually a defect in the wall separating the atria or right and left heart chambers, that could have enabled a clot to pass from the venous or right side of the heart to the arterial or left side of the heart. If that happened, a clot could enter the upper body circulation and end up in my brain. But the chances of having a hole were quite small. A hole in the heart existed at birth in less than 0.5% of all babies, and 90% of those holes spontaneously closed very soon after that. A hole in the heart was, therefore, not very likely. An unclosed hole in the heart by adulthood is a condition called patent foramen ovale. In a stroke like mine, with an unknown cause, one of the specialists decided it was worth investigating. And in my case, finding such a hole would raise the suspicion that the clot causing my stroke was related to the factor V Leiden, originating in the lower body. Information like that would determine what medication was required: an oral anticoagulant instead of antithrombotic agents such as clopidogrel. A standard echocardiogram was done and revealed no defects. Soon after, the doctors followed that with the TEE, transesophageal echocardiogram. That procedure was rather unpleasant since I had to swallow an ultrasound probe that was inserted through my throat to position it behind my heart. The contrast fluid that was injected would have passed from the right to the left side of the heart if there had been a hole, but the examination indicated no such problem. They saw bubbles, but no contrast fluid. I was now one of the 10% of all stroke patients who never received an explanation for why it had happened. Still, the doctors decided it would be wise to keep me on blood thinners and cholesterol-lowering agents, even though I didn't have bad or high cholesterol. Without knowing what caused my stroke, they preferred to stay on the better safe than sorry side of things. But I eventually stopped all medications. It was a long flight, but I didn't mind. I had been looking forward to that trip for 3 months. I loved thinking back to the last time Remco and I had been to Hawaii 18 years earlier. We were so in love back then. I was 24 and he was 31. On that trip, one particular day in January 1988, Remco saved my life. We were on Little Beach near Wailea, Maui. I had been fascinated watching 3 young women with boogie boards, who I assume were born in the area. Thinking back on that vivid memory, they were impressive as they paddled out on their boards and rode the waves. Whenever they saw a wave big enough, they would start paddling, their boards picking up speed, and either sit or come up onto their knees to ride the wave to the beach. "I want to do that," I said to Remco. So the next day, we rented boogie boards at Snorkel Bob's and went back to Little Beach. Just as I had seen those girls doing, I casually walked into the water with the boogie board safety line attached to my left wrist and a rubber flipper on my right foot. I teasingly told myself that I felt like I was already a pro. The waves were somewhat higher than on the previous day, but I couldn't wait to get out there on my boogie board. At first, I made steady progress. I learned how to get past the breaking surf and then sped up to catch a wave. I might not have been as good as the 3 young women I admired earlier, but I was doing reasonably well. Suddenly, bigger waves came toward me, and one hit me head on, causing me to fall off the board. Churned beneath the waves, I felt like I was spinning around in a laundry machine with no chance of escape. Gasping for air, I managed to get to the surface, but the current was so strong that it dragged me further and further from the beach. I knew I needed to calm down. As I saw another wave coming toward me, I remembered to duck and dive under the wave and then swam beneath it. Under the water, I needed to keep my shoulders in the correct position to hold on to the board, go down, and wait for the wave to pass over me. I must have done that at least 8 times and was beginning to feel exhausted. As the current continued to drag me away from the beach, I popped up between the waves, saw Remco, and called out as loudly as I could. He must have realized I was in trouble because he was on his boogie board and at my side in no time. He managed to save us by instructing me how to swim back to shore. I say us because 2 days later we received joyous news. I was pregnant with Martin. From that time on, I had a great deal of respect for the power of the ocean waves, especially when Remco made fun of me for not going out into the ocean anymore on those trips. Those were the days, I thought, smiling. Now we were on our way to Maui, Kauai, Hawaii, and Oahu. I look forward to Maui the most, especially being able to experience a piece of paradise again on the road to Hana. Although jet-lagged with our body clocks out of sync, we got up at 4 a.m. on our second day. Off we went in our Jeep Wrangler. The road to Hana may only be 52 miles long, but it has an exhausting 617 hairpin curves and 59 one-lane bridges. That makes the drive around 2.5 hours long. Little wonder that the road is sometimes called the Divorce Highway, as a result of those argument-inducing obstacles. No one else was on the road at that hour, and we drove in darkness for the first 10 miles. We'll see this part of the road on our way back, and there's plenty more ahead, Remco told me. When the sun was about to come up, we stopped to enjoy the sounds of the birds calling, distant waterfalls, the ocean, and utter silence from any human sources. For a moment, I forgot the previous 8 months of struggle. I felt alive. By the time it was 7:45, we had already paused along the road several times. We then stopped at one of the most beautiful waterfalls I've ever seen, just 20 meters from the road. Remco and the children took a narrow path so they could swim under the waterfall while I took pictures. I was confident that this day couldn't be beat as the best day of vacation. But 24 hours later, I had to correct myself after another fantastic day, and I decided to throw away my walking cane and brace. I sensed that my somewhat impetuous decision to throw them both away at the same time annoyed Remco a little. I had already been walking quite slowly with my cane and brace, and throwing them away meant that I was going at a snail's pace. But there in Hawaii, I felt no hurry. I firmly believed that I had made the right decision. It's now or never, I thought. Let's see if I survive this. I knew I was up for the challenge. I had been reading a lot of research on neuroplasticity at the time, and it seemed to me that survival was an essential part of it. If I could trick my brain into believing that the only way to walk and survive from here is without a cane and brace, wouldn't that be the path forward? The first 2 weeks of walking without those aids were horrible. Not only did I move like a snail, people also stared at me. As I walked, I leaned, sometimes precariously, to the left side. I couldn't get my toes up, and I struggled to not overbend my knee. The children were not amused to see me walking this slowly, but I wholeheartedly believed in the most recent science. Through repetition, doing something consistently again and again, I could force neuroplastic changes in my brain. That would allow me to walk normally again, soon. In more primitive times like the Stone Age, when there were no specialized canes, no braces, and certainly no wheelchairs, people may have recovered more quickly in certain cases because they had to survive. Otherwise, they could die from factors like starvation and exposure to the elements. Tobbs' research found that monkeys could move their affected hand quite quickly again when it was necessary to feed themselves. If a skill was essential for survival, the brain freed up the required space for that skill. However, a modern lifestyle can sometimes get in the way of this incredible process. In his TED Talk about how brain plasticity can change your life, Michael Merzenich observes, "We pave even the path of our countryside so that every footfall is certain, so that there can never be a challenge to moving across the physical environment. Believing that I could challenge my personal status quo by walking without a cane and brace, and doing the opposite of what Merzenich mentions in his talk, I thought to myself, I should start walking on grass, stones, and beaches. I began walking barefoot as soon as I could because I read somewhere that walking barefoot improves balance and proprioception. Proprioception is the awareness you have and get back from your limbs. I have to warn you, please do not do this at home without assistance from a physical therapist. At any rate, I imagine that the cane and brace were not invented yet, and that put me in survival mode. In the beginning, it was quite hard. I came close to giving up many times, primarily when my foot was too tired or I had difficulty bringing my toes up. I could only flex my foot about 2 centimeters, less than an inch, with a significant amount of concentration. If I was tired, I couldn't manage to do any of it. When I began walking without a brace, I could only get my right toe up, nothing else. But I hung in there. 3 weeks later, I slowly begun to get a hang of it. That doesn't mean I walked perfectly, not at all. It was more like not every single person came up to ask me if I was alright, just a few. If I hadn't taken that rebel standpoint, I may never have been able to walk freely again. I got so excited about my new success that I published about my stroke and follow-up achievements on Facebook and Instagram. Now everyone I knew, even distantly, had learned about my stroke. It was a relief to get it out there. Maybe it took me almost 9 months to share the news about my stroke, because I felt ashamed somehow. I still don't know why it took so long for me to do that, but I probably first had to deal with and move past the feelings of failure in my life. I had finally reached a point where I was not ashamed anymore. The stroke had become a part of who I was. My mind was already wandering off, though, to what I was planning to do next. Run. Chapter 20. Jumping. It was all up to me now, whether or not I would recover and how much recovery I would achieve. I already felt moderately confident about being able to walk reasonably well for a stroke survivor, but maintaining my balance while coping with a blind right eye was still a significant issue. I bumped into things all the time. I was also dealing with a plate and 16 screws in my right leg from falling the year before the stroke, and that previous injury had left a lingering pain that I sometimes felt while walking. I had been relying on my right leg more than my left leg since the stroke, but at that moment, I couldn't care less about those aches and twinges, since I was finally walking without a brace and cane. It might take me 5 or 6 years, but I believed I would walk normally again. It was time to set up a team to guide my recovery. I needed a physical therapist, a speech therapist, and a gym membership. Femke, one of my therapists at Clemendal, had contacted a speech therapist that she knew. "His name is Sander," she said. "He's good, and you're going to like him." She was right. I did like him. We met every Friday for half an hour. The first time, I told him that my goal was to speak normally again. He didn't give me the look of pity I had seen too often. Instead, he said in a very straightforward way, "Okay, we'll work on the goal." Unexpectedly, I encountered numerous obstacles when I began to look for someone to provide constraint-induced movement therapy, CIMT, which you'll remember from the story about Tom's monkeys. CIMT was impossible to find, in the Netherlands at least. As it turned out, the Dutch medical system only provided it for children. When my sister Isabel tried to contact the Swedish CI therapist, they said they couldn't offer it either. I had a Swedish passport, but I was also a registered citizen of Germany. Trying to laugh through my frustration, I suggested, "Just send me the bill." But they said no, and that it was due to bureaucratic reasons. Still, flitting around in my brain was another issue. I had to decide whether or not I was going to break my right arm. Every person I shared this idea with thought I was crazy. Continuing to believe that I needed to enter survival mode as part of my healing process, I was confident that breaking my right arm would jumpstart me in that mode. My brain would be forced to make use of my affected left arm and hand to perform simple but necessary tasks, like eating. I didn't care about people's default reactions, and I had already realized the importance of developing my own methods. I was convinced that I had to think outside the box and do what felt right to me, even when I met resistance from those around me. Recovering from a severe stroke was about overcoming challenges. Nobody could make those necessary improvements for me, so I needed to rely solely on myself. If that meant I had to break my right arm, so be it. As I thought about the list of things I wanted to learn again, I knew I would have to be smart about it and take it one step at a time. Inspired by a story from Norman Deutsch's book, I thought that perhaps I should start crawling again, like a baby. I had already realized that learning to use my left foot for walking again was easier than relearning to use my left arm. My brain had no choice but to make use of the affected leg. Thousands of steps every day was enough repetition to get there. When crawling, I would have to rely on both my arms and leg for support, so I was forced to make use of my affected left side. Reading up on the brain taught me that there is always a competition of cortical real estate, which in my case, my right arm was easily winning from my left. Even though I was born left-handed, my left arm would just hang there, letting my right arm do all the work. All the neuroplasticity I had engaged up to this point was used to teach my unaffected right hand. Since the stroke, I learned to do everything with my right hand. Buttoning and unbuttoning my shirt, eating, writing, all of it. I imagined that my neurons were firing and wiring together to make my unaffected right arm better in performing all tasks. So, how was I going to make it stop doing that and create improvements in the left hand instead? I didn't have an answer just then, but I hoped CIMT was a solution. Being accepted for any CIMT program was going to be a daunting task. I learned that I needed at least some functionality in my left hand to build on. Even when I found a therapy practice that would consider my application, I couldn't meet the basic requirements. I had failed all the tests that required me to bend my thumb and index finger together. That motion was the most essential first step toward picking things up, and I couldn't do it. My challenge would be finding a way to develop those basic skills on my own. I had a goal now, and it was an excellent first step. I spent an entire week planning my training while I tried things out to see what would and wouldn't work. As I ordered stuff online, trying to find tools that could be useful, I came up with several ideas for exercises that might eventually help me reach my goal. At one point, half our living room was filled with exercise equipment. Cue unhappy husband. I started playing table tennis, aka ping pong. I had been quite good before my stroke, so I was convinced that my brain must have some of my former moves still hardwired into it. Since we had a ping pong table at home, it was indeed worth a try. I couldn't hold the paddle at first because it was too heavy. Unfortunately, ping pong proved to still be above my entry-level skills at the moment. As an alternative, I came up with the idea to hang a tennis ball on a rope in the middle of an open door. I could hit it with a different, lightweight paddle in my affected hand. At the beginning of my ping pong adventure, I must have looked like a poorly programmed robot. My arm was still so spastic that I rarely hit the ball when it swung in my direction. Attempting to hold the paddle in my hand for more than 30 seconds was futile. After those brief seconds, the paddle would fall out of my hand without me feeling a thing. Still, I continued to believe that it was a start. I worked at it for about 30 minutes at a time. At first, my sessions consisted of trying to hold the paddle while also trying to hit the tennis ball for 30 seconds. When the paddle fell out of my hand, I was so exhausted from the effort that I needed a 5-minute break. After 3 weeks with almost no improvement, I was about to give up, but I didn't. The obstacle is the way. The obstacle is the way. The obstacle is the way. I would tell myself over and over again. Marcus Aurelius, thank you for your wisdom. The Stoics helped me persevere for those 3 weeks, and soon after that, I began to see glimmers of improvement. I was able to hold the light paddle for about 40 seconds at a time, and my arm extension was a full 5 degrees more. To an outsider, these improvements would hardly be noticeable, but to me, they were huge, motivating me more than ever. Neuroplasticity, here I come. As you read this, you might be wondering how I could get so excited over such a small improvement. For me, the answer is simple. I had been learning all about the brain and the nuances involved in recovery. It takes time to reprogram the brain. It takes thousands of repetitions and countless small improvements that build upon each success. The motor map in my right brain had been destroyed, and the sensation in my left arm and hand was down to almost zero. It would be a long process, and I knew that. Recovery of my arm and hand was like a puzzle. It may take 15 years, I thought. After 6 months of consistent effort, I replaced my light paddle with a standard ping pong paddle. By then, I could hit 2 balls in a row while the tennis table was up on one side. That hadn't been an option 6 months earlier, so it was evidence that my hard work had begun to bear fruit. Encouraged by that progress, I continued to practice and purchased a box of 500 ping pong balls on eBay. They were cheap balls from China, thin and easily broken. I couldn't have cared less. As soon as I felt that my hand and brain were up for the task, I increased the rigidity of my stance and firmed up my grip. But progress doesn't always proceed in a straight line. There were days when my hand became so spastic that I couldn't hold the paddle at all. Other times, my hand was so tired that I couldn't hold it for more than 5 seconds. When that was the case, I used duct tape to wrap the paddle around my hand. Why did I choose table tennis? Weren't there better ways to recover, like golf, bowls, basketball, painting, or even playing Xbox or PlayStation? I'm not a scientist, but for me, there was a clear and well thought out set of reasons for my choice of table tennis. I wanted to train my arm and hand to select the response rapidly from the countless alternatives of where the ball might be coming from. There were also other reasons. First, I had read that table tennis could improve a person's balance. Staying balanced and being able to change direction quickly is key to being successful in table tennis. Second, it improves coordination. Following the ball as it moves quickly towards you helps develop hand-eye coordination. Third, it stimulates different parts of the brain. By anticipating an opponent's shot, or in my case, the ball bouncing off the table tennis wall, a player makes use of the prefrontal cortex for strategic planning. Fourth, the aerobic exercise from the physical activity of the game stimulates the hippocampus. This part of the brain happens to be responsible for long-term memorization of facts and events. Furthermore, table tennis helps keep your brain sharp. Alzheimer's Weekly found, after a series of preliminary clinical studies in Japan, that table tennis remarkably increases blood flow to the brain. A measurable increase in motor skills and cognitive awareness were results. My sixth and final reason for choosing table tennis was that the cerebellum, little brain, is known for its important role in motor memory. I didn't get my stroke in the cerebellum. Thus, I reasoned that my motor memory had to be intact. Since I have always been very competitive, I could visualize how I played table tennis with my left hand before my stroke, and make use of that visualization in my rehabilitation. I got a so-called tennis glove to stick to the racket in my hand instead of holding it. But the glove was too heavy for me. I felt like I was in a trance when I played and hated that I could only last for 5 minutes before my hand couldn't hold the paddle anymore. I also had no one to play against. That surely would have brought out my competitive instincts, but I didn't blame anyone for not wanting to play with me. I was too slow and I could only hit about 1 in 20 balls coming my way. When I ran out of energy and my hand was tired from holding the racket, I began to crawl on the floor with the brace on my left hand, separating my fingers. Then, after I exhausted myself from crawling, I would sit quietly and read. I learned that left and right brain hemisphere coordination was boosted by crawling, although it was distressing that the left part of my body still just hung there limply. Gross motor skills and fine motor skills are part of the baby's physical development. Those stages of development are activated by crawling. Gross motor skills are larger movements a baby makes with its arms, legs, and entire body. The fine motor skills used by the hands and fingers and toes enable babies to balance, grasp things, and move items to their mouth. All those skills develop further when they learn how to write, tie their shoelaces, and button their clothing, and are a direct reflection of their advancing higher cortical development. What I read confirmed my gut feeling that I needed to move like a baby as part of my recovery. With a grin on my face, I imagined the staff at Klimendal treating stroke patients by teaching them how to crawl and pick things up from the floor before they were allowed to relearn walking. I firmly believe that such training, despite being a bit embarrassing, would have been better than urging patients to time their walks around the block over and over again. Since I knew crawling was also good for the development of hand-eye coordination and balance, I began consistently crawling over the next 7 months for 2 hours each day. But in spite of all that work, my left arm continued to move to the outside of my body's core, while the right arm moved correctly, aligned in parallel to my core. My chiropractor and functional neurologist, who you'll meet in another chapter, Arjun Kupkers, explained later that I had been trying to crawl at too early a stage in my recovery. He played an essential role in my further improvement when he set up the pre-crawling exercises for me. Without realizing it, some of my other trial and error efforts had been done too early as well. When I wondered how I would use my left hand while reading, I thought, use Braille. I bought some large wooden alphabet blocks with letters and corresponding Braille dots on them. It was not a coincidence that I chose Braille. I had already studied it. I read that for blind people, touch activates not only the tactile area of the parietal lobe, but also part of the occipital lobe in the back of their head, which has to do with vision. A blind person reading Braille experiences activation of both the tactile area and the visual area of the brain. This brain activation may cause a heightened sense of touch in blind people. However, in reading Braille, the brain must not only perceive the shapes of the characters, it must also understand those shapes as a language. A blind person reading Braille probably, hypothetically, uses the same language areas of the brain as a sighted person does, such as a temporal lobe area above the ear called the Wernicke's area. I felt stimulated by this information because I thought it might somehow help improve my speech as well. Italians have an expression, tutte le strade portano a Roma. All roads lead to Rome, meaning there are many different ways to reach the same goal. What I also knew about brain neuroplasticity was that there were several ways to achieve the same goal. I needed to reprogram my brain to use different paths to be able to speak in an order to achieve my goal. Unfortunately for me, since I couldn't feel the letters yet, reading Braille was out of the question. I soon stopped going to the gym I had just joined. It was the closest to me, only 10 minutes away in a nearby village-sized city. I knew quite a lot of people who used that gym and felt uncomfortable going there after my stroke. One day, while I was using the leg press machine, an acquaintance came up to me and said, "Hello, Linda, is that you?" I nodded. "How are you?" she asked. I didn't have time to reply fine because she just kept talking, saying, "I heard you had a stroke. That's terrible. And it must be awful for your children. How is your husband dealing with all this? It must be terrible for him too." Unable to cut in and answer her barrage of questions, and thanks to my limited speech, an awkward silence followed. I just turned around and ignored her. The third time something similar happened, I began to cry, and then was angry with myself for crying. I wanted to scream at them. Why don't you say something encouraging like how wonderful it is that you keep fighting and that I will manage to get over it? All people had to say was, "That's so terrible, and isn't it awful, and blah blah blah." I was overwhelmed immediately. Of course I knew it was dreadful to deal with the aftermath of a stroke. I was living that reality every day. So why remind me of that? For all of you reading this book who happen to be acquaintances of stroke survivors, I have some advice. Speak in a positive and encouraging way, will you? I never went back to that gym again. Luckily, I had Bart working with me once a week. Bart is a physical therapist who graduated in 1984 in the Netherlands and then went to Germany and got a degree studying orthopedic manual therapy. He was a big guy with gray hair, a broad chin, and friendly eyes. I knew him from our previous work together when he treated my broken leg and knee. He was always friendly and we laughed a lot. Bart also complained rather often about insurance companies. He called all insurance companies thieves. I agreed with him by that point. My insurance company had denied all my claims, and I had to pay for most of my rehabilitation myself. I asked him tons of questions about different exercises in the brain, and he answered them as best he could. One time, I asked him about the trampoline in our yard. "Do you think I can jump on the trampoline?" I asked. "No, it's too dangerous now. You don't have the stability or balance to do that yet, but maybe in a year," Bart answered. "Okay," I said. With a smile on his face, he left for the day, saying, "Until next week." As soon as he was gone, I went out to the yard and made a beeline for that trampoline.